It's This Week in Creationism, episode number 31. I'm your host, Joel Duff, and here's where we take a look at the headlines in creationism from this past week. Oh, wait a second. It's been a lot more than a week since I last made an episode. In fact, it's been around a month. So sifting through all the different options I had to talk about, I realized there's a lot of sort of big picture issues going on in creationism. And although I usually do a yearly State of Creationism video, I thought it's time to do a mid-year State of Creationism. There's so much going on. So let's just talk about the big stuff, the big issues. And to do that, we're going to talk about Jeanson, Carter, and Lisle drama, a little bit about dino feathers, and for fun, some gender issue topics from Answers in Genesis. All of that coming up. Yeah, okay, so it's been a while since I've done a This Week in Creationism, and I'm a little overwhelmed by the number of different articles and things that have been come out in the last month that I could comment on. But I started to see a couple different themes, like really important topics that need to be addressed. And I thought, let's put that together into a sort of, hey, what's the state of creationism, as we sit here midway through 2022. We're coming out of 2 years of this global pandemic, and that's certainly had a big impact on Young Earth Creationist Ministries, which very much depend on going out and giving talks to big crowds, right? And their different museums. So you have the Institute for Creation Research. Maybe you've forgotten because you hadn't heard about it, but there's the Discovery Center at ICR, and that's their creation museum. Which honestly, I have not heard very much about. I hear very little buzz about it. When I search social media, there's very little talk about it. I could hardly tell you really what's in there after 2.5, 3 years of being open. I guess it's unfortunate timing for them that the coronavirus came along not soon after it opened. And I had a lot to say about that several years ago, about my concerns about them spending so much money on this creation museum to, I won't say compete with institutes or Answers in Genesis, but in essence, it's a very local museum is the way I feel about it, local to the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and is not bringing in a large number of people from outside. So that's one thing that, and that I'm kind of talking about this because this leads into the state of creationism as being like, where are things at with the different major apologetics ministries? And ICR, I've been saying for a while, has separated themselves from the other ministries, and I think it's something of a strategic sense, but I think a strategy that ultimately is going to fail, and we're going to see some examples of why Institute for Creation Research is probably headed for some troubled waters, and we'll get to that. All right, but their money behind their museum, and then some of their other decisions they've made in terms of the positions they've taken on a number of different scientific issues, put them in a precarious position in terms of the entire field of creationism right now. All right, and then we've got the Ark Encounter, and you've got the Creation Museum that Answers in Genesis sponsors, and by all measures, they seem to be very successful right now. They've bounced back from the pandemic, and they have, I'll say, as many visitors as ever. I mean, Ken Ham likes to say they have record numbers on, they're getting record numbers of people, but if you read that very carefully, it's on, certain days they have record numbers, and that could mean anything. There's no hard numbers, like total number of visitors per week or something like that is never divulged, so we don't really know how that compares, although we have some data from tax information that suggests that the numbers aren't actually higher in terms of numbers of total visitors, although because their prices have gone up, they might be able to say that their income has gone up over time. And so the Creation Museum, Ark Encounter, Answers in Genesis is still the behemoth of creation ministries out there. And there's also this Is Genesis History, group that had that documentary that I've talked about how important that was, a watershed moment for creationism overall. And they are currently still fundraising to try to finish off their sequel, which they had expected to have come out earlier this year, and now they're talking about later this year, although I certainly think it's going to get kicked back probably to early 2023. And I think that's something to watch because they are kind of outside of the major creation apologetics ministries, ICR, CMI, and AIG. But they use resources from those different organizations in order, resources being people, right? In that documentary. And depending on who they use, they're going to be supporting certain viewpoints within creationism, and the different organizations have different viewpoints on a variety of different important topics. And so because they're outside, and they will be creating a documentary that I think a lot of young earth creationists and people with young earth creationist leanings will use in the future and watch. They're going to set sort of some of the vibe in terms of like, here's where young earth creation is on certain things, like where is the flood boundary in the geological column, and like how much speciation occurred after the flood versus and how did that occur, like what are the mechanisms for that. They're going to be making some statements about those things that are going to have a tremendous influence on the future of creationism, simply because every group and organization is going to have to kind of respond to the fact that at a grassroots level, many of the average young earth creationists in a pew, or average Christian, is going to have seen their material and being influenced by it, much like most people have heard Ken Ham and are influenced by him, and he certainly is sort of sets the tone for what the average person thinks about young earth creationism. Or if you don't know what young earth creationism, you probably think that everyone thinks like Ken Ham, although that's not really the case. If you follow young earth creationism, there's lots of different viewpoints. And we're going to see that in today's State of Creationism mid-season version. So that I'm looking forward to that Is Genesis History film, and I'll certainly review it and talk about it quite a bit on this channel when it finally comes out. And so there's just a lot of percolating things in young earth creationism right now. And so rather than me talking about that more, let's just get right into some of the stories. So we are going to look at some specific stories, publications from young earth creationists over the last month, but they will allow me to then expand out and talk about sort of where I think young earth creationism is, and I will also do some further speculation and prediction about where we'll be at the end of the year when I give my big overview of what happened in creationism this year and where do I think it's going in the year 2023. All right, so let's get cracking. And let's start with Nathaniel Jeanson and his book that was published this year, Traced, which purports to trace, right, the history of humans from the flood to present, following all the different people groups around the world through genetics, through the Y chromosome. And that has had, now here's where I have to be careful. Has that had a big impact or not? I mean, a lot of people know about this book. The more interesting question is, how much impact will its conclusions have on the world of young earth creationism? Let's dig into that, starting right now. Okay, I said we'd start with Nathaniel Jeanson at, remember that he's the Harvard-trained biologist, I don't want to say geneticist, biologist at Answers in Genesis. And he published this book, Traced, Human DNA's Big Surprise. And as you'll see, it's been promoted by Ken Ham as Dr. Jeanson has found the Rosetta Stone of human history. And Dr. Jeanson has been on he's been making a series of videos, usually about once every week. He's sort of progressing through the entire book, chapter by chapter, and he's either being interviewed by Ken Ham or a couple different people and talking through the book in order to promote it, right? And so he's also been going out on tour, you might say, in terms of speaking with people to being interviewed for podcasts. He's been on a couple of YouTube channels and so forth. Right. And not too long ago, he was on a YouTube channel, and it was sort of an open format. And there were individuals that came and asked him questions there. And that was a bit of a direct confrontation maybe with some of his critics. And in response to that, he wrote a blog post, which you can see right down here on the bottom, came out on June 21st. All right. Traced and the Critics. And this particular blog post he has on his blog on Answers in Genesis appeared here, and I almost missed it because Ken Ham never mentioned this particular blog post. He usually promotes like everything that comes out on the Answers in Genesis website, but this kind of slipped through. It's really just, I think, a message directly to the critics that only they are going to find. They're not really interested in having the broader audience read this, because it's Jeanson essentially saying, my book has been noticed, right, by the critics. And he references in that particular article one of my YouTube videos in which I'm not going to say I've reviewed his book, because I haven't gone through and I haven't done a blow-by-blow review of Traced. And I explain in my video review, all right, that the reason I'm not going to review his book is because I don't, until others take it seriously, and by others I mean other young earth creationists, take this book seriously. And multiple individuals within young earth creationists say that this is a valid understanding of human history, that what Dr. Jeanson's done here is produced a robust history using DNA techniques, all right, tracing the DNA history of human populations, until other young earth creationists kind of get on board, write positive reviews of this book, and say this is really important. Then I think the outside community, those outside young earth creationists and critics of young earth creationists, do have some responsibility to say, okay, young earth creationists have rallied around an idea. And so this is going to be an important idea that is spreading within young earth creationists, and therefore deserves at least some attention as like, what is this and what would the response to that be? Until Dr. Jeanson gets that kind of consensus within the young earth creationist community, and builds the bridges within young earth creationism and convinces his own colleagues that what he has written and come up with himself is worth spending time on, it's a lot to ask others to spend a huge amount of time reviewing his book. Nonetheless, I've made a video. I've also talked about this multiple times in several other This Week in Creationism episodes. This particular video, which I'll link at the bottom of this video I'm making right now, Untraced Lineages Reveal Rosetta Stone Flaws, goes through a few things that I think are problems for Nathaniel Jeanson. And I'm actually suggesting they're problems within that he creates problems for Answers in Genesis and the young earth creationist community. And I want to see what the response of the young earth creationist community is to these particular critiques. I've also critiqued him in another way with generically, I talked about Answers in Genesis and their chronology issues, and using his techniques to try to, I guess you would say, recalibrate the carbon-14 scale. And so there's another video which I discussed that. So I appreciate that in this particular article, he does make reference to the fact that he has presumably watched my video. And he talks about how in this and other videos, he talks about he has responses. So he's going to have some kind of video response to this in the future. All right, so here we go. I'm not going to read this whole article, but just to give a little flavor for it. Traced and the Critics. the first unplanned debate has already happened. He's referring to this YouTube interaction, and I was there and I witnessed this particular interaction between Nathaniel Jeanson and a number of other critics. Traced marks the dawn of a new era in creation science. Traced meets the gold standard of what defines science, and the research in Trace exceeds and demands that evolutionists, the demands that evolutionists have made of creationists for decades. Wow. I mean, that is quite a couple first sentences. And I kind of feel bad for Jeanson at times because I feel like he's been left to be his own biggest promoter, in which case he kind of has to make these very outlandish statements about how important his own work is. Although Ken Ham has been saying things like he's found the Rosetta Stone and all these things, and Ken Ham has been sort of hyping him up, as his employee, that he's essentially commissioned to write this book. And we'll see that I think this book plays an important part in the future directions of some things that Answers in Genesis is doing, and which is why this book and Nathaniel Jeanson's success is very important for Answers in Genesis. But to be forced to write this about your own book, about how wonderful it is and how you've exceeded the demands of others, and so forth, is just it must be hard. I don't know. Maybe it's not hard for him to write this stuff. Maybe he really does have that kind of belief in how important his writing is. But nonetheless, he comes in full guns blazing. This is really important stuff. And the thing here is he's saying evolutionists have noticed, right? There's a couple people who have written critiques, and this is what he's been begging for. He's been begging people to write critiques because he wants to be noticed. And I think one of the big problems with Traced and his previous book is really how under the radar they've gone. For all the hype that Answers in Genesis puts behind it, and all the ways they try to sell the book and talk about how it's an important step and so forth, it has made virtually no dent, right, in outside of creationism for sure. All right, made absolutely no difference. Nobody has noticed, other than people like myself, which follow young Earth creationists. Some are really interested in it and what's going on there. But also within the young Earth creationist community, replacing Darwin has had, I'll say, some influence, but I wouldn't say that a lot of other creation scientists have picked up on his particular methodology and particular viewpoints and are taking them forward. It's simply well, yeah, that was great. We have somebody who's written this stuff up. That's fantastic. But it's not create a whole new research enterprise or direction of thought within young Earth creationism. And with Traced, I think it's similar. There's even fewer reviews of Traced out there. For the amount of time it's been out, I followed very closely Replacing Darwin, and now we have this book Traced. And I've searched the internet far and wide for reviews, and there are many fewer friendly reviews. Now, friendly reviews would be you send out the book to people that are other young Earth creationists who have blogs and so forth, and you want them to write something about your book. And basically, support it, right? And I mean, this is what all authors do and all publishers do when they first publish a book. And so you get buzz out there. Well, the buzz has been much, quieter, I'll say, for Traced, at least from what I see. I think there's a lot of buzz within certain creationist groups and communities, but in terms of just the sheer number of interviews, number of people saying you gotta buy this book and so forth, not so much. And so he really wants expert critics, and he knows, and he doesn't expect anyone, I think, to have a positive view outside of, well, I would think he hopes that other young Earth creationists would have positive views of the book. He doesn't expect anyone outside of young Earth creationism to have positive views of the book, because the book is really just written for young Earth creationists. It's not meant to change anyone else's minds. And he wants critics because critics then allow him to respond and make it seem like his book is important because it's being criticized. But I'm going to go right back to what I've said many times, and that is that I am waiting for other young Earth creationists to take him seriously, to take Nathaniel Jeanson seriously, to come out and say Nathaniel Jeanson is brilliant, He has not necessarily that he's solved this whole problem of human history, how to trace human history and place it within a 4,500-year time frame, but at least he's made exceptional progress, and this is something we should hitch our train to, and we should improve upon his particular model. Like, let's work with it. He is stimulating, inspiring another generation, inspiring other young Earth creationists to take up his work and then to promote his work, right? I said I don't feel like I need to do a lot of response until I see that response from other young Earth creationists. And I predicted that I don't think that response is going to come. I see so many flaws in his work as well as others that I think other young Earth creationists will see, and I know other young Earth creationists see that because I know a lot of young Earth creationists who are very critical of the methods of the book and are very skeptical of his primary conclusions, even if they agree with the overall assumption that the human race is very young and that everyone is descendant of Noah just 4,500 years ago. How he explains it and how he groups all those individuals is of people are dubious, let's say, within the young Earth creationist community. So knowing that, I said, look, somebody else who's a geneticist, somebody else who knows at least something about genetics needs to write about Jeanson's book and say, yes, this is good stuff. Read it. So last week, or maybe it was 2 weeks ago, the Journal of Creation came out. Well, that's the journal from the Creation Ministries International. All right, it's actually published in Australia, the parent company of CMI. And in the Journal of Creation, the latest issue, there is a review. And I have to admit, I was surprised. I really didn't think that his book would be reviewed in a timely fashion or maybe at all by other young Earth creationists. There were very, very few reviews of Replacing Darwin outside of their own self-hyping it in their own organization, Answers in Genesis. But here we have it. Item number 34 in this issue. The Promises and Pitfalls of Correlating Y Chromosome Genetics to Human History by Dr. Robert Carter. Traced Human History, Human DNA's Big Surprise. All right, so here's a review of Jeanson's book. Let's take a look at that particular review. I think it's very important to think about what's going on here. First, I want to show you the editorial board of this journal. All right, so Journal of Creation by Creation Ministries International, and you'll see that their address is actually in Australia, even though the main group of them is down in, I believe, Atlanta, Georgia. And the editorial team consists of a couple members of Creation Ministries International that are regular employees of the organization, plus some other peripheral scientists who are then on the editorial board. But I want you to notice that Dr. Rob Carter is not on the editorial board, even though he's a full-time employee of Creation Ministries International. There's totally nothing wrong with that. But I'm telling you this to let you know that this isn't Rob Carter simply saying, I want to write this review and I'm going to publish it in this journal that I'm an editor on. No, he had to have permission, essentially, to write this review. He was either asked to write the review or he felt strongly himself about writing the review, but he had to pass it through an editorial team, which is essentially Creation Ministries International. And he's going to write a review of a book published by another young Earth creationist organization, Answers in Genesis, which they have a long history, right? Because their history is the two organizations were one organization at one point that split in the early 2000s. And there's still some bad blood there today about that particular division. And so this is a big decision to write a review of a very specific review of work done by that other organization, especially if it's not going to be a positive review. And I think you've already caught my vibe, right? This is probably not going to be a positive review. And so I think Creation Ministries International has made this conscious decision. I'm sure they discussed it. You know, is this something we want to do? Do we want to put out a review of this particular book? So let's take a look at that review. The promises and pitfalls of correlating Y chromosome genetics to human history. Well, you can see from the title, there are promises potentially to using Y chromosomes and Y chromosome genetics in human history. But obviously, Rob Cotter is going to think there's a few pitfalls involved as well. Reading the first section here. Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson, a fellow creation geneticist. All right, so Rob Cotter considers himself a geneticist, and he's calling Nathaniel Jeanson a geneticist, although I just want to remind you, Nathaniel Jeanson is not a trained geneticist. He's a developmental biologist, and so he's not trained specifically in this particular field, but Rob Carter's sort of referring to him as a geneticist. Obviously, he's written a book that is essentially a genetics book, or based on genetics. Has recently published Trace, Human DNA's Big Surprise, a book that claims to explain biblical history using genetics. Now, as he said, a book that makes claims, and boy, does it make claims, all right? Ham makes claims. Jeanson makes a tremendous number of claims in this book, claims to explain biblical human history using genetics. It's exactly what, that's an apt description of what that book is doing. He doesn't say here that he accomplishes those claims, but he does make, he's just saying he makes claims. An endorsement on the book cover says he has found the Rosetta Stone of human history. I've already emphasized that. That is a bold claim to say that you have found the Rosetta Stone of human history, right? So Carter sets this up by, okay, this is a huge claim, and an endorsement, which he doesn't say is by Ken Ham, an endorsement says that this is the Rosetta Stone, right? So this other organization is claiming they have the answer, essentially. That's what this first paragraph says. Answers in Genesis is claiming they have found the answer to understanding biblical human history. Now let's go on in the review and say, have they really found that answer? I'm going to pick out some highlights. The book is sparking a lot of interest within the creationist community. Yes, that's true. And for good reason. It's the first book of its kind. Now, it is really the first book, not the first article, but it's the first comprehensive book that tries to say, I'm going to explain biblical human history, meaning I'm going to understand everyone who's alive today, how they're related to Noah and his sons and their wives. He has done a significant amount of research and deserves commendation for an interesting hypothesis. There's a scary word, interesting, right? Full disclosure, Dr. Jeanson and I have discussed these issues in depth over many years. Yes, we know that Dr. Carter and Jeanson have had a friendly relationship, and they have bounced ideas back and forth with each other over time. He even had me review one of the chapters prior to publication, for which I received a glowing acknowledgement, and I talked about this in my review of sorts, in which I talked about who actually is in the endorsements, who's in the acknowledgments, and how almost none of them are geneticists. And I thought that was a problem. And I had said, well, at least Dr. Carter's there and could be one person who would have evaluated his work. So I was actually surprised by this when he said that he reviewed only one chapter prior to publication. I had assumed that he had the entire book and that he had worked with Jeanson, or at least given feedback on the entire book. So I'm kind of shocked that he only received one chapter prior to publication. And so this indicates to me that that relationship isn't quite as cozy as I thought it was. And so then coming down here, we see the observations made in this review are purely in the interest of robust peer review, which we believe to be a healthy exercise when promoting various hypotheses, right? So he's setting us up now to say, and he's absolutely correct here. In order to have a healthy exercise, in order to have real science going on here, you need to be able to take criticism, and we need to bounce ideas. We need to subject other people's hypotheses to critiques to make them better. That's the way science should work. Right? So obviously he's going to have some critiques. All right. He's going to do some robust peer review here. And I do think that by saying robust peer review, he's also indicating that this book could have used some peer review, which is what I've said as well. This book desperately needed some peer review. And this is why I'm shocked that Robert Carter only got to see one chapter of this book, because I thought he was the only person who would even have an inkling of how to understand the science behind what Jeanson's claiming in this book. I couldn't see anybody else who either endorsed the book on the back. None of them really were even close to being a geneticist, or anyone in the acknowledgments who you could say, oh, they've read the book. At least he had somebody else who could maybe critique him on something he said. I thought Carter was the only one, and now I find out that even Carter hasn't completely reviewed the book, right? So he's saying it needs, some robust peer review. It should have had it before the book was published, but now the book's published, and there's a whole bunch of problems with it. And if we're going to continue on, if Jeanson's going to continue on with this hypothesis, he needs to really consider these things and figure out where he's going to go with it. So he is saying, look, he needs some help. And here are some things that I want to point out. So you start out, and this is typical reviews, you start out by trying to talk about the things that you like about the book. He does point out some things that I really bothered me about the book in terms of the structure of the book and the figures being about impossible to follow in the book because they're all in the center of the book. But let's get to the meat of it. All right. A third issue, I'm skipping the first two issues, all right, appears early on. The analysis begins without explaining to the reader what's going on. For example, how does a person compute the age of a group of people or the timing of a historical event from a phylogenetic tree? He's using phylogenetic trees and then trying to map onto those the times of different events when things happen in human history, when different people groups move to different portions of the world. This is not explained, but multiple hard dates start appearing near the beginning of the book. Yes, Jeanson starts just throwing out like this happened at this particular time, within 100 years. And you're like, where did that number come from? How did he know when this particular people group got to this particular place in time based on genetics? How is he calculating that? This is not explained. They are cited with no qualification and no explanation of where they came from. It would have been beneficial to have provided a brief explanation with a pointer to detailed methods in the included appendix. Now, I know Jeanson will say, I've written other articles. In fact, I've written tens of thousands, of words about how these calculations are done. And yes, sort of, but certainly the person who picks up this book, the average person who picks up this book and reads it, will never be able to read those articles and understand them, because almost nobody can understand them because they're very difficult to follow. And so you need at least some simple explanation of the methods you used to suggest you have a methodology. All right. And it's just sort of like the feeling you get at the beginning of it is just trust me. I'm a smart guy. I have a PhD from Harvard. Ken Ham says, trust me, I found the Rosetta Stone. And so therefore, I don't need to explain how and why I got these results. You just know that behind the scenes, all right, if you pull away the curtain, all right, there's a man back there pulling the levers, and I'm that person, and I know what I'm doing. All right. And so just go with me here. That's the feeling you get reading this book. As Carter says here, there are hints in the text. Where am I at here? There are hints in the text in a few footnotes that this material was once part of the main text. I suspect that as well. I suspect that his original writing was far more complex, and another editor, an editor for reading, not an editor for accuracy, right? But an editor for readability, chopped him down because he does need a lot of work in terms of simplifying things. Just like I need a lot of work in terms of not talking so long and being more economical with my words in speaking and in writing. I'll admit, I definitely had that problem as well. That the material is once part of the text. If so, its removal may have simplified the material, but the lack of explanation may prevent supporters from answering skeptical objections. Well, heck yes. All right. I mean, there's one thing I am certain of, and that is if I could easily hand somebody 4 or 5 questions to ask about the material in this book, like, well, how do you know this? How do you know this? Where did this come from? And anyone who reads this book is not going to be able to answer those questions, right? And they're not going to know where to point to or how to find those questions. All right. And interested readers can follow the citation list to obtain the material, but the casual reader will miss out. And yes, they certainly will. Now, that was 3 problems, right? 3 issues. Those were minor issues. He starts out with the minor issues. Then he builds up to bigger problems. And as we'll see, even bigger problems, in this review. Important information missing. And boy, as I read this review, I thought, Robert Carter is right on. He is thinking exactly what I was thinking, and several other critics that I know have either thought through personal communication or have said publicly that are some of their biggest problems with the book. Strangely, and I like that word, strangely, in a book about human history, there's no discussion of genetics or of ancient people like Neanderthals and Denisovans. Jeanson would agree that these people were human and thus descendants of Noah, but where do they fit in? Where some living people are up to 7% Denisovan, 3% Neanderthal, should we not talk about how they can be 10% non-modern in a flood Babel context? First thing I did when I opened that book was I wanted to know, how is he going to fit Denisovans and Neanderthals into the human history? Because you're purporting to explain all of human history. It's the Rosetta Stone. And this is what I think the average person is going to think. I've heard of these Neanderthals, like, how do they fit in? I've always wondered. And then he doesn't mention Neanderthals in the book. Well, they're mentioned. The word comes up 3 times, but not in the context of trying to explain them within the framework of where they fit in human history and the Y chromosome genetic data. It is bizarre that they're just completely ignored in this book. And so you can't claim to have explained human history if you can't explain the thing that people are most interested in understanding about human history. Also missing is any discussion of mitochondrial genetics and how mitochondrial DNA can also be traced back in time. At least sort of try to say, hey, this also supports my methods, or maybe it doesn't. And the thing is, Robert Carter has done stuff with mitochondrial DNA. But Jeanson seems to just want to be all his own thing. All right. It's not a community. It's like his thing. It's like all of my discoveries. He admits not knowing much about history several times in the book. Yes. He's not, and it's appropriate for him to say that I'm not a historian. I'm not completely trained. I might not know all these things. I've done a lot of reading, but I might be missing some things in this area. Well, the thing is, he's not a trained geneticist either, right? He doesn't talk about that in the book. And the things he might be missing out about genetics. So the reader's left wondering if his conclusions are more tentative than they may seem. And exactly, you should be very tentative. He's not tentative. He is very sure of himself in his answers. And I think that's one of the things that's most off-putting about the book is that he is going to, on the flimsiest of data, suddenly make very profound and what he thinks are robust explanations. All right, you notice the bottom there? Major differences of opinion. All right, so all these were minor, and now we finally reached the major differences of opinion. Molecular clocks create highly unlikely scenarios. Now, I'm already too long-winded here because this is the review of the year, and you're wondering how does this play a part in the big picture of creationism? I'm building up to that. And so I don't want to go over mutation rates and all that, but I just want to show you that Rob Carter picks out what I think is one of the biggest problems, and that other critics have had with this book. And down here, he says, he's talking about how Jeanson concludes things about how Native Americans were in North America, but then eventually went extinct, and then another lineage came in and so forth. He identifies that as being pretty much ludicrous and impossible statistically. To put it simply, this is highly unlikely. And then Carter continues on, and down here, the probability that they would all end up in the same branch at random is vanishingly small. Right? To say that at random, all lineages but one peter out across both continents is making a statistically indefensible argument. I thought that exact same thing as I read the book. And again, I'm not going to go into the details of like what Jeanson's claiming here. I just want to point out that Carter is saying that Jeanson's work is statistically indefensible, at least this particular argument, but there's multiple arguments in the book that are, I'll say, they're wishful thinking. They're sort of like hopeful statements, but not based really on statistics and actual evidence. And furthermore, are there more Y chromosomes to be discovered? Jeanson kind of like, one of the things he does is he kind of like, there could be, we're gaining more data. We're going to collect more samples. There might be hidden lineages out there, because he has a whole bunch of things that are unexplained. And kind of holds out the hope for the reader that, oh, we'll be able to fill in the gaps because there's additional lineages out there that will kind of tie in, and they'll continue to support my hypothesis. So he throws out some speculative hypotheses and then suggests that they'll be proven correctly in the future. He likes to make predictions so that if any of them come true, he'll say that, well, I made a prediction and it came true, therefore I must be right. But as Carter says, there really aren't going to be any more Y chromosome lineages discovered. There may be some in ancient DNA, although Jeanson likes to ignore ancient DNA. He says that we have, there's not very big chance we're going to change the overall phylogenetic tree of the Y chromosome. We had to deal with what we have because there's not going to be that much more. And I think he's right from a statistics perspective. So you get to the conclusions. So here's Carter's final word here. Traced represents a significant milestone in creationist literature in that it represents a major attempt to bridge the gap between biblical history and modern genetics in book form. Yes, that's a lot of qualifications, right? It's a significant milestone in creationist literature. That if he just stopped and put a period there, we'd be like, okay, that's a pretty nice endorsement. In that, but he has a comma. In that it represents a major attempt, all right? He's tried to bridge the gap between biblical history and modern genetics in a book form, okay? So all those things. Yes, there aren't any other books in creationist literature that try to do this. So that's a significant milestone. And he's made an attempt to bridge the gap between biblical history and modern genetics. So those two things nobody has done before, so therefore it's a significant milestone. Nothing about that sentence says that Carter thinks that he's correct. All right, that he has come up with a valid way to explain that history, and it's a robust theory, a robust hypothesis. And the very next sentence tells you that. The conclusions are perhaps more tentative than the claims of the book indicate. In other words, he's claiming far too much for his own results. Right? He should have been more circumspect and made it this is a hypothesis, and here's all the different reasons why this might not be correct. No, he just goes forward and allows Ken Ham to say that he's found the Rosetta Stone of human history and has all the answers. So readers should be cautious about taking what is said as the final word. And the book really makes you feel like, well, this is the final word. I've just given the answer. I've given you the Bible, all right, for understanding human history within the biblical context. Much more work needs to be done to bring ancient DNA in the fold. That's one thing he talks a lot about in the review that's missing, and I've also critiqued that as well. And better mathematical models of human population and genetic history still need... Better mathematical models of human population and genetic history still need to be developed. Notice he doesn't say, this is a great start, this is a good mathematical model, it just needs to be tweaked and it will become even better. So let's try to do this, this, and this to make it better. He's saying better mathematical models of human population and genetic history need to be developed, which suggests other hypotheses, all right, other ways of doing it. This is not a rousing, rah, everybody should go out and buy Jeanson's book. There's nothing in this review that says you should read this book and there's great value to having read this book. Everything in this review to me suggests this book isn't worth reading, right? It's a nice attempt. And maybe for some scholars out there, young earth creationists who are interested in this topic, yes, they should read the book so that we can learn from those errors and we can come up with better ideas. There's nothing in this to suggest to the readers of the Creation Ministries International audience through this journal that that everybody should be rushing out and the average person should be picking up this book. All right, so now that said, this goes back to what I have said continuously for the last couple of years about Jeanson's work. And he'll complain that I haven't done a detailed breakdown and a real serious review of his work. But I'll go back and I'll say it again. Until others take him seriously, why should I spend an enormous amount of time taking him seriously? It's not worth the effort. He has to convince his own colleagues first. And I thought Carter was the one person he had that could potentially do it. I said in my original speculation when the book first appeared, or right before it came out, that he really should have published it with Carter. I thought they were working together much more closely. And then when he didn't publish it with Carter, I thought, well, maybe they had a falling out and that Carter didn't agree enough to publish it. But it looks like Jeanson's just been on his own this entire time. And he's on an island. I cannot find another creationist geneticist who has background in genetics who feels like this is an adequate solution, an adequate hypothesis to trace human lineages through the Y chromosome this way in a 4,500 year time scale. Just haven't done it yet. Maybe it's still out there. Maybe there are reviews to come that are going to be glowing reviews that say that this is the young earth creationist answer. But just because the person who hired you and works for you says that and has his own self-interest in this book being sold, makes it sound like this is the answer. And you yourself have to write your own articles telling everyone this is the answer and how great it is. That's not very convincing. It just isn't convincing at all. Now, let me tie this into the bigger picture. All right, a year ago, there was a press release from the Ark Encounter from Answers in Genesis. What's new and what's to come? What's the new thing coming with the Ark Encounter? Right, they have expansion plans. And a lot of people made fun of this because they said they're going to build the Tower of Babel, right? And it is, they have the new Tower of Babel attraction coming. Now, it's going to take a while. They're working on their carousel, which I'll talk about at the end if we ever get to the point of getting to the end of this particular video. My fun item has to do with the new carousel. That the Ark Encounter will begin raising funds for the Tower of Babel this year. Right? They are raising funds to build the Tower of Babel, which will likely take 3 or more years to research, plan, and construct. This is going to be a big deal. All right, this is going to be a large addition, the biggest thing added to the whole complex other than the actual Ark itself. Now, what I have highlighted here, among other things, the huge Babel structure will help people understand how genetics research and the Bible confirm the origin of all people groups around the world. You see what's happening here? Jeanson's been working on this book for a couple years. Right? At the same time, they've started this planning for the Tower of Babel. Right? Jeanson's book comes out a little bit, months after this particular press release comes out. And I'm sure the hope is here's the book. It's going to, everyone's going to be excited about it. It's going to stir the young earth creationist community. And he, in that book, lays out, and he's doing a whole series of videos in which he's just explaining where different people groups came from and how they're related to Noah's sons and so forth. All right. It's very Ancestry.com or 23andMe type stuff. People are really interested in ancestry. But they want to put the correct biblical worldview glasses on it, right? That This is all occurs within 4,500 years, and you can trace yourself to one of the sons of Noah. And so this would be a fantastic attraction, right? And we're going to put this in the Tower of Babel because that's where, everybody was at one point. And so we can talk about the origins of people groups and how they spread out across the earth after they were divided at the time of Babel. Guess what it's all based on? It's all going to be based on the genetic research that Nathaniel Jeanson's done, right? The displays and where people groups are and how everyone's related. And, there's going to be probably a giant tree, right? Showing the history of all the different people groups there. What's it based on? Jeanson's Y chromosome research, which means that's really important. He has this right? They're going to build a multi-million-dollar structure of which one of the centerpieces is going to be predicated on Jeanson's results on this book. And so what you have is you're going to have a monument built to bad data, right? Bad analysis. And Rob Carter and others and other creationists see this as not a very good, stone to build your foundation upon. But Ken Ham is throwing it all in there. Now, I wonder what will happen. If this continues to be the way that Jeanson's received in the creationist community, will Ken Ham's eyes ever be opened to, whether his employee knows what he's talking about or not? And whether he wants to invest having what he's going to show millions of people be based on shoddy, let's say shoddy analysis, right? He better be sure it's right? And if he can't get other young earth creationists to agree that the fundamentals of his analysis are at least close, are in the ballpark, then he's going to build a monument to misinformation. And so that's my warning, I guess, to Ken Ham, is to think twice about putting this much effort all upon Nathaniel Jeanson's very solo individualistic work. All right, you're depending on one person. All right, so that's something to think about in coming up, and how the world of creationism is shifting. And and that's why I also go back and I'll say that this is why I pointed out that Rob Carter writing this review is really important. It's really important. Like I said, I was stunned when I saw that. I was like, I did not think he'd write a review. And I certainly didn't think it would be that negative. I thought there was all the reason to be that negative. And the thing is, he's trying to be nice. I think he truly, we are all in this, we're a small community overall, young earth creationists. We do need to try to stick together. But he's right. There needs to be some kind of peer review. And he felt compelled to provide it in a very public way. The fact he's providing in a public way means he didn't make any traction in a private way. And this is the theme to my, what now is already at least a half hour, 45 minutes, discussion of the state of creationism right now here, midway through 2022, because this isn't the only example where private disputes or private disagreement will spill out into public, published disagreements among creationists because they feel compelled to say that somebody else is wrong. All right. And they care about, they all truly do care about, in a way, the truth. And they see others leading young earth creationists astray. They do feel like they have to call it out. And we're going to see two more examples of this. Okay, here's another one. Not as big a one, but wait, feathered dinosaurs. So at the New Creation blog, which is sponsored by Is Genesis History, and I've talked about how these are part of what I call the New Creationist, which is kind of a different wing of creationism, sort of outside of the major apologetics ministries, which are very much controlled by individuals. Here we have this article by Christian Ryan, a young student, a geology student. He writes great stuff. Really enjoy his writing a lot. Wait, feathered dinosaurs? And this asks the question that a lot of creationists have been writing a lot about and arguing about is what exactly is the distinction between a dinosaur and a bird, right? And can you have feathers on dinosaurs and not call them birds? And before I go on, let me just remind you, Is Genesis History is finishing up that sequel, Mountains After the Flood, and I think that's going to be a really important film, as I said before, because by describing what the post-flood world looked like, it's going to have to deal with where did the flood stop and where did the post-flood world begin. So what features as you look out across the world are the result of things that happened after the flood. And there's huge disagreements about this in the young Earth creationist community, including ICR, which has set themselves off to the side, I think, with insisting on a different flood boundary than most other creationists. Where will Is Genesis History land? Which position will they take? Who will they, and I already know they're going to use Andrew Snelling big time in this film, which means they're going to take a particular position on the flood boundary. And that is going to set the mood, I think, going forward in terms of this discussion. But it has a lot of other implications, too, about how young Earth creationists should view the history of the world after the flood. And that's going to create a lot of disputes within young Earth creationism. So anyway, if you want to see this film, they still say they need money to finish it up. They've already had more than 1,000 people donate money, and they've collected 190,000 of their 275,000 goals. So I think they'll soon be reaching that, and they'll finish that film up, as I said, probably early next year. All right, back to the feathered thing. Now, a lot of this comes down to, in 2018, at the proceedings of the International Conference on Creationism, which is a group that meets every 4 years. There's a lot of papers. It's kind of like a scientific society, and they get together and they talk and they give talks and then they write papers based on that. There was a very interesting paper published out of that by Matthew McLean and Matt Petrone, who you'll see are at universities. So these are researchers and faculty members, so not members of young Earth creationist organizations. And they write about feathered dinosaurs reconsidered. Right? New insights from baraminology, that's the creationist version of taxonomy, and looking at taxonomy, all right, other forms of taxonomy. And they conclude in this, in that paper, he concludes that there are many things that we would typically describe as being a dinosaur because they have X, Y, and Z characteristics of dinosaurs, but that they had feathers. Right, and there's a bunch of different kinds of feathers that different dinosaurs had. And then Christian Ryan is kind of summarizing that and sort of giving a big view. That's what I like about Christian Ryan's writing and all the articles at newcreation.blog. They're kind of like putting a big picture spin, or big picture look on the world of creationism. And so as he says, one recent study found, however, young Earth paleontologists recognize many distinct groups of dinosaurs that go back to the ancestors God created during the creation. Okay, there's lots of different dinosaur kinds, because dinosaurs don't have a common ancestor in the young Earth creationist world. There's just many different kinds of dinosaurs that then changed into varieties. One recent study found that there are at least 8 distinct groups or created kinds of feathered dinosaurs. Right, and that's a reference to McLean's work. So there are 8 in this, for this particular person, there are 8 different groups or different kinds of dinosaurs that have feathers. Each member of a single created kind of feathered dinosaur is related, all right, within the kind, all right, there's like 20 different species or 5 different species of Archaeopteryx types of things or something like that. And they all have feathers, right, and they're related to one another. But they're not related to birds because don't have all the other features of birds. And they're not related directly to other dinosaurs because they're also separately created in their own kinds. In other words, they're their own thing, right? They're their own unique kind of creature. And then the last sentence here that Christian Ryan has is great. He says, rather than emblems of evolution, feathered dinosaurs represent the creativity, ingenious design, and downright beauty in which God fills his creation. He has the attitude that God can do whatever he wants, and if he wants to create a kind of organism that has dinosaur-type features and feathers and even potentially flies, God can certainly do that. And since different bird types are not related to each other anyway, ostrich has a different origin than does a raptor, who's to say that God couldn't do this? I think it's a very reasonable approach. I've been suggesting young Earth creationists take this approach for a long time, that they give up on sort of like dinosaurs don't have, all dinosaurs, all reptiles don't have feathers, and only birds have feathers, as if birds was like a group that could be identified as a whole unit. And that's what Christian Ryan's done. That's what I call the new creationists have done. They've been very willing to say that, yeah, there's these other bizarre groups. They got four wings instead of two, and they have these types of feathers, and they have feathers that are like, not fully formed feathers like some birds have. They have like these other sorts of feathers. All right. But that's just like God made those separately. I think that's a much better solution. I don't think it's the best explanation for the observations of the data, but it's a much better solution than trying to force round pegs into square holes, which is exactly what Answers in Genesis does. All right. It appears that they've had enough of this compromise, right? They've really gone off on a lot of other creationists lately as compromisers. And the trend continues. Dinosaurs and birds' clothing, on thinking biblically about dinosaurs. When they bring out the biblical word, it's kind of like, oh, we're going to apply the Bible. And it implies that those who have a different viewpoint, are not being biblical. Right? It's a great rhetorical device. And it's this classic Ken Ham, right? We're biblical, you aren't. But who are they talking about here? They're talking about other creationists. They're talking about other young Earth creationists here. We're not talking about compromisers outside of creation. We're talking about compromisers within creationism here. And who's been sent to do this task? None other than Dr. Gabriella Haynes. And she's one of their newest employees. So they're one of their newest PhDs. And Ken Ham loves his PhDs, loves to talk about them. She is got a PhD in Brazil, and so she's moved up here to the U.S., and she has a PhD in paleontology. And so you'd think she'd be able to assess data like about dinosaur bones and dinosaur feathered dinosaurs and so forth, all right? All this paleontological stuff that's coming out of China. But wow, doesn't seem like, from listening to her on Answers, the weekly thing, Facebook show, and other places, I am not convinced that she knows what she's talking about. But let's get to this article. And I presume she wrote this article, although all these Answers in Genetic articles kind of sound the same, use the same kind of language. And I don't know if that's because they've all been sort of mind melded into thinking the same thoughts, and so they just write the same way, or whether they have a common editor who takes whatever they write up and then just puts it into the framework that all Answers in Genesis articles seem to have. This article is a warning to Christians. All right, we're going to warn Christians to be discerning when it comes to accepting creationist research. I was like, what a first clause. We're here to warn Christians to be discerning about accepting creationist research. We do creationist research. You should be discerning about creationist research, just as we would with other research. Underlying evolutionary assumptions are everywhere. In other words, evolution has crept into young Earth creationism. All right. It's seeping its way into the fold. Now, here at Answers in Genesis, we don't allow such a thing, right? We're not compromisers. We examine everything we do to make sure we shove out any evolutionary assumption. Therefore, discernment is always needed. All right. In Answers in Genesis, we're going to provide you the discernment you need. In researching and critiquing the claims of the video from Matthew McLean, he made a video talking about his results. This is essentially a critique of that article from the creationists get-together. I am challenging his results. All right, so I'm not going to go through the article. It's really boring. She goes through a bunch of different stuff, but here's what she's doing throughout the entire thing. She's trying to say that birds are birds, and birds have feathers, and so anything that has a feather can't be a dinosaur or reptile. And so she's trying to maintain this very strict distinction between the two things. And so Archaeopteryx and a bunch of other things that have feathers immediately go into the bird category, and there's just this very clear bird thing, as if there's as if all birds have to have all the same types of features, even though there's different kinds of birds, which obviously have different features from each other. But somehow this feather thing is the thing, even though the Bible doesn't say, like, feathers are something that define what birds are, which is why I don't understand thinking biblically about dinosaurs. It's not like there's a biblical criteria here. There's not much of a biblical criteria for you to decide these things. But her main complaint is that all the evidence that McLean uses is pretty much evidence derived from papers written by evolutionary biologists who are saying, like, see these feathers, these are like half-formed feathers. They don't have all the features of a full feather. And therefore this is an intermediate thing. And just, by accepting that this dinosaur-like thing has partial feathers, you're accepting the evolutionary story. Matthew McLean is doing nothing of the sort. He is not even coming close to accepting the evolutionary model. He's simply accepting the facts, all right, from these different fossils, that there are organisms that have bony tails, all right, toothed beaks, right, some forms of hip structure and so forth that are more like other dinosaurs than they are any other living bird. And yet they truly do have feathers. And he's saying, well, that's just a different kind. That's not a dinosaur as we traditionally understand dinosaurs. And they're not birds as we typically think of birds. There's something that are between, but just be saying they're because they're in between doesn't mean they're a transition fossil between the two. He's not making such a claim. And she's adamant about this. The question of a feathered dinosaur is not merely an academic exercise with little real-world application. There's a big issue because at its core, the idea that dinosaurs displaying a coat of feathers is an evolutionary one. Oh, so because evolutionary biologists came up with the idea that some dinosaurs had feathers, therefore it's an evolutionary idea, and all of a sudden creationists can't accept it? That's so ridiculous, right? Oh, because they meant to bolster their, in other words, she thinks evolutionary biologists made this up just to bolster the claim that birds and dinosaurs are related and the birds are actually dinosaurs, right? Just because they believe in that connection, that's how they interpret the data. We can't even accept that there are actual organisms that lived in the past that had dinosaur-like features but had feathers and maybe even were able to fly. This is the logic I see from Gabrielle Hayes in every time I hear her talk. It's all about biblical worldview. She's all about everything is just biblical worldview. And then it's sort of like, I have some expertise and I'm a PhD in this, but she doesn't seem to be able to think beyond just like the things she's read from Answers in Genesis material and just absorbed, and she's just spitting back over and over and over again. And then she comes up with this warning. Since Dr. McLean is a college professor, all right, and you need to be worried about colleges, right? Answers in Genesis only thinks you should go to like 3 different colleges that it might be safe. He is training the next generation of creation scientists to, perhaps unwittingly, accept certain evolutionary assumptions as fact. And this has dangerous ramifications for future research. All right? Dr. McLean is a danger to young Earth creation because he's allowing the research that evolutionary biologists do to inform some of his decisions about how we're going to decide what kinds are different kinds, even though he is not accepting evolutionary biology as common ancestry of all these different things. All right, creationists, we need to be careful not to allow compromise with evolutionary ideas to creep into our research, or biblical faithfulness will eventually be lost by either this generation or the next. This is the monotonous, statement that's sort of tacked on to every single one of their articles. Watch out. All right, so the feathered thing, is another area where young Earth creationists disagree. And I have a whole article on all the different responses that young Earth creationists have had to feathers. And there is an evolution of how young Earth creationists have viewed feathers over time. Some creationists have evolved in how they view feathers, and that's not a bad thing. They are following the data. And they're coming up with better explanations that fit a creationist model, I think a biblical model, better by doing that. Others are simply, this is the way we've always thought, and then any change, because it's based on something an evolutionist might have suggested, we can't accept it. I mean, it's like saying we just reject facts because they're tied to some interpretations of those facts. It's kind of sad to see that. And Answers in Genesis is especially subject to getting in these. This is the way we've always said things. This is what we've always believed, and we're not changing. And not changing is good, right? They put a spin on it as like, if you change, then that's just the slippery slope. All right, item number 3. All right, my third example of, I'll say, growing discontent within the Young Earth Creationist community. Jason Lisle. This was 2 months ago, and I missed it originally. I only just recently got to see these 2 videos. He has 2 videos on his YouTube page. And his YouTube page is Biblical Science Institute. And remember, Jason Lisle, I haven't talked about this much on this channel. I don't talk about the Biblical Science Institute, but you could consider that yet another Young Earth Creationist organization, although Jason Lisle is very interested in just Christian apologetics in general. He's a presuppositional apologist, and I have some affinity for that particular style of apologetics, and but that does put him at sort of odds with a number of other creationists in terms of their style and their types of approaches to answering questions, the big questions in Christianity beyond just the science questions. And so I've always had suspected that one of the reasons he left ICR, because he used to be at ICR and was a prominent member of ICR, and he's also worked for Answers in Genesis in the past. So he's kind of gone through the, the iterations, right? Answers in Genesis to ICR, kind of like Nathaniel Jeanson was ICR to Answers in Genesis. And now he's doing his own thing, right? He has his own, he's, sole operator and runner of this organization, the Biblical Science Institute. All right, back to the video. Discerning truth, refuting false claims regarding natural selection. Now, who is he talking about? Well, you see down here, we expose some of the false claims and errors in reasoning of Randy Guliuzza in his recent webcast from ICR. All right, he's going to, in 2 1-hour videos, I'm going to use the word demolish, all right, the claims of Randy Guliuzza about natural selection. I've done a whole video on the Institute for Creation Research about how they believe that natural selection is not real. And, what do I mean by not real? That they believe that Randy Guliuzza doesn't think that natural selection is a real force and is able to do anything. They have a completely alternative, or I'll say Randy Guliuzza, who's now the president there, has a different view, all right, of how organisms adapt and change in the environment, called continuous environmental tracking. And he has put all of his marbles, all right, in this new view. In the video that Lisle's talking about here, Guliuzza talks about how they want to build an entire new understanding of biology, all right, based on this continual environmental tracking, which is it's an engineering approach. And Guliuzza admits it's an engineering style approach to understanding biology. And Guliuzza isn't just talking about himself here. He's dragged the entire Institute for Creation Research into this because he has made it one of his 2 main objectives for the Institute of Creation Research going forward. And so he has tied the organization to his view that natural selection is not a real thing. Jason Lisle, I've always suspected, I knew he disagreed with Guliuzza on this because he and Nathaniel Jeanson wrote a paper in the Answers Research Journal which disputed Guliuzza's view, this particular view of continuous environmental tracking, and talking about how natural selection is a real thing, and it's one of the best papers ever written in a Young Earth Creationist journal. I read that article, I was like, they are right on. Their critiques are spot on. They understand this idea of natural selection, and they're right in virtually every aspect of what they say. So they wrote in the answers, and they had a back and forth. Guliuzza wrote an article. They wrote a response to it. All right, they're sort of acting like research academics. They're disagreeing with each other, but they're doing this in a format. Presumably they did this originally by, personally. And then they had enough disagreements. They thought, well, people are seeing this in the literature because we're both publishing, both organizations are publishing things talking about this. So we need to find some way to show people, let them read for themselves what we think about the other viewpoints. Now comes these videos several years later. And what's fascinating about this particular, especially part 2, I really encourage you to watch part 2. I'll try to remember to put some links to these. Lisle talks about how he left ICR, and I had never heard him talk about the exact reasons for this, but he says straight out that it's really this disagreement about where Guliuzza is going, right? Because Guliuzza had these ideas there before he was president, and then it became apparent that he's sort of taking control of ICR, and Lisle's going to be out because he completely disagrees with him. And he said that, they've discussed it many times, and he's shown Guliuzza how he's wrong, right? He is incorrect about this. And he's placing far too much emphasis on it, and he's taking ICR down this path in which they're going to just be wrong, all right? And so you can tell that Lisle doesn't want to have this kind of conflict. But he obviously feels very passionate that ICR is not on the right trajectory. They're not doing the right thing, all right? That they're promoting a false view of how diversity, how organisms change over time, a false view of how organisms might adapt to their environment after the flood. And he says in this video that he would not trust the information coming from ICR. Just outright says that. That ICR, maybe they had some great stuff in the past, like when he was there. But now he would not recommend ICR as a source of information. That is quite a statement coming from a fellow young Earth creationist, to just say you should ignore the Institute for Creation Research. And I think this is very important going forward. Randy Guliuzza has, like I said, I'm being very repetitive, but Randy Guliuzza has tied the Institute for Creation Research to two things, which, if he's wrong, is eventually going to be the demise of ICR. One is continuous environmental tracking, which from my viewpoint doesn't share any support outside of his organization, other than a few individuals who find it maybe interesting thing to think about, but they're not jumping on board. And a very recent flood boundary, right? Those are the two big areas that they're thinking about. And I don't have time to go into the flood boundary thing and why that's really important. But those two things, I think they're going to come out on the short end of the stick on. Because Answers in Genesis, Creation Ministries International, and all of the new creationists and other academics outside of the creationist organizations, and Jason Lisle, think they're completely wrong on these topics. And I think that they're going to become more vocal about this. And Institute for Creation Research is going to become more defensive. And those who are there are going to have to make decisions about whether they're going to go down with the sinking ship. And right now, they're all, vocally supporting Guliuzza, and they're promoting all those ideas. But I'm not sure when it's going to sink in, just how wrong they are. And what's going to happen. But this is a major breaking point that's coming within the creationist community, and it'll be very interesting to see how it plays out. And I really think that these two Lisle videos are a very important way of looking at what's happening. He's very straightforward. Lisle's when he gets on a roll with laying out the logic and the biblical rationale for why he's doing what he's doing, I think he's a very powerful force. Lisle's an interesting character because sometimes I really agree with a lot of things he says. I think he is very good at critiquing other young Earth creationists, and he's very correct in his critiques. And yet at the same time, he's completely wrong, in some areas, and super stubborn, when he has an idea of his own. There's a reason why he's out there, I think, by himself. And he's a mixture of good reasons for being on the outside of other young Earth creationists because he sees their errors, and yet has, like I said, I think has his own flaws. All right. One other thing I'll say that as sort of the bigger picture idea here. Institute for Creation Research. There's this organization called Logos Research Associates, and I just realized I've got it covered up. And they're not well known at all, but they're kind of tried to be just for the academics in the young Earth creationist world, right? For the PhDs, right? And the idea was to get all the PhDs that are in all the different organizations to have this organization where they can work on some research, kind of independent of being members of Answers in Genesis or Institute for Creation Research. Like, try to unify things. I mean, that really is one of the main goals, was to try to create some unity. But Answers in Genesis never really joined them. I don't know whether the individual scientists there didn't want to join, or whether Ken Ham didn't allow them to join, which is very much a possibility. But it has ended up being a collection of sort of independent creationists, and Institute for Creation Research is very heavily involved there. And so now that you see how this connects to what I just said, right? Institute for Creation Research is going down this separate path, right? They've made a conscious decision to be different than all other young Earth creationists, take different viewpoints, and take them strongly. And I'm sure this is creating some issues for Logos Research Associates. And so here they have their annual meeting coming up. And I'm just showing you the list of the talks. Now, this doesn't show you the titles, but this is what they're anticipating. You see, here's Clary. Here's Tompkins. And then we've got Guliuzza. We've got Thomas. Right, all of those are ICR, the big four, really, at Institute for Creation Research. And the rest of these are names, some of them which I don't know, which is saying a lot because I know a lot of the creationists, right? Not know in terms of personally, always. But they are sort of the fringe players in young Earth creationists, right? They're not part of other organizations. So the only real organization involved here, the people that are involved in a large apologetics ministry, is Institute for Creation Research. So I think they're having an influence, or at least they're allowed to come. They're being treated in a friendly way at this particular organization. But I think they're going to come under increasing pressure. And the fact that they're there means that it's very hard for maybe CMI or Answers in Genesis to show up, because these disagreements are very serious. They have wide-ranging implications. And, of course, there's also personality types involved as well. So Young Earth Creationist they've got some interesting times coming up with what's happening with ICR. And ICR's future viability, I think, is very much in question. I mean, we're talking years, probably, not months or anything like that. Okay, so that I've gone through, I think, most of what I wanted to say about kind of like the big picture of like where the interesting areas of change are occurring in creationism. I promised one additional fun item. All right, I'm trying to do this with This Week in Creation and find something that I just found curious, but at the same time it's fun. I think there's also a serious point to be made. So Ken Ham on his Twitter account has been promoting the new construction at the Ark Encounter. And one of the things that they're adding right now and will be done in another month is a carousel. All right. And, it's some special carousel, I don't know, being built in Italy and shipped over here. And I can't remember, I might be wrong about Italy, but it's Europe somewhere. And so he's been posting pictures of the construction. And a couple days ago, he posted a picture of the construction. And it really, to me, it's kind of a jarring image, and it kind of made me laugh a little bit. And let me just talk about what I thought when I saw it. All right, so here's the things that I saw. So on the top of this carousel are like depictions of things that people are going to also see in the Ark Encounter, right? They're trying to keep it with the theme of the Ark Encounter, animals coming to the ark to be saved. And so here in this first image, we see two, I guess, bear-like things, and we see two giraffes. Now, notice that the giraffes have short necks, which is what the giraffes on the ark have in the Ark Encounter, because they believe that okapi and giraffes are related to one another because they're the same kind, and okapi have short necks. And so long-necked giraffes evolved from these short-necked giraffes, and also notice they have stripes. All right, why they have stripes, I don't know. But here's the thing I want you to notice. The two animals look the same, and these two giraffes look the same. In other words, this is the pairs coming to the ark. The pairs coming to the ark look virtually identical to one another. In nature, most large animals, especially mammals, there is something called sexual dimorphism, where the male and the female have different attributes. Now, they have obvious sexually different attributes. I don't expect them to be displayed at the Ark Encounter. That's not what I'm talking about. But differences in having antlers versus not having antlers or having very small ones between a male, elk and a female elk, I would expect that those would be differences that would exist prior to the flood and should be in animals that are on the ark. And yet the animals that are displayed coming to the ark are essentially gender neutral, right? They're identical to one another. It's like, I don't know if they're trying to, insert your wokeism, your gender identity jokes here about why they're doing this. Here's another example. Oops, I'm going to get rid of this ink here. Here are two extinct groups of things. These aren't pandas or anything like that. These are two extinct. This is an extinct kind. But again, the two individuals are virtually identical to one another. And then look at this panel. Here we've got the giraffes again. We have two dinosaurs, but the dinosaurs look the same. Well, reptile male and females usually look pretty close. But here we have two animals that are probably like the antelope kind, but they both have the same horns. Right? And the two bears look the same and so forth. So this is a trend that I've not just seen right here, but I also see in other members of the Ark Encounter. And here we have some of the actual things that kids will sit on. And again, they're all what look to be identical pairs. Why is there no differences between the sexes? And then here's the other curious thing. How did this come about? This is conscious. This is a conscious decision. And I'm not sure exactly why this decision was made, but I'm pretty sure this isn't an accident. This wasn't simply like, hey, we got a graphic artist here and we're going to say, like, we just need some animals. Like, show us some cool animals. Look, here's some animals we got on the Ark Encounter. Make us something that looks kind of similar to that. And they just went off on their own and did that without thinking about what the biological significance of what they were drawing was. No, I think there was some time and thought put into this. The giraffes are the same as the giraffes that are put on the ark. And what they're trying to say is that these are the average organism of a kind. They don't represent like an exact species that's alive today. It's an amalgam. But where's the genetic diversity? Like, how did animals get off the ark and then become all these wildly different things if the two individuals that got on the ark looked identical to one another, meaning they probably had similar genetics to one another? That doesn't make sense. But I also just don't understand the unwillingness to like draw males and females being different when the emphasis at Answers in Genesis over the last year is to talk about in their article. I skip these articles when I do This Week in Creationism, but they almost have something about gender identity, gender fluidity, all the gender things going on in society. They talk about that ad nauseum, all right? And that there are two different sexes, right? Everything's made male and female, and there's a distinction. It's very clear what the difference is between the two, and there's never a mixing of the two. And then they go and show the animals get in the ark, not even be able to tell which sex is which. It just blows my mind. I just find that curious. I find that kind of funny. And we reach the end. Finally. So that's my Well, that's my thoughts on where young Earth creationism is midway through 2022. I've got a big backlog of interesting articles that young Earth creationists have written, and some specific points I want to make and bring to your attention. But we'll save that up for the next episode of This Week in Creationism, which will hopefully return to a weekly basis, so we can dive into some more of the details. Hey, if you're still here, thanks for hanging out with me. I had fun, and I appreciate your attention. That's it for today. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.